Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome back to another video. It's Ben and Kiesha today. And today we have a fun little video where we're just recording a philosophy talk. So obviously the majority of the videos we post on this channel are physical yoga asana classes. And often the teachers on this channel will weave in some yoga philosophy into those classes, but I think it's fun to just spend some time to sit and think and talk about the philosophy. It can be something that can not only enhance our physical yoga practice, but can also have an impact on our lives off of the mat. This is something that is super interesting to Kiesha and myself, and we're lucky to have Kiesha here with us for this conversation because Kiesha is just a big wealth of knowledge, and we're both just huge nerds in this area of learning. So we're gonna go through the Yoga Sutras, and this is gonna be hopefully the first of several videos that we may record about the Yoga Sutras, because it's such a vast body of knowledge that we could spend lifetimes kind of dissecting and talking about this wisdom, but we'll just see where it goes. We'll see how far we get, and drop in the comments any questions that you have that arise from this conversation, any concepts that you might want us to come back to. We can answer you in the comments or make another video about it. And if you're new to the Yoga Sutras, use this as an introduction. It's okay if things are confusing. And if you have a copy of the sutras, you can open it up and follow along with us. And we can always recommend translations for you to buy if you don't have a copy of the sutras. So with that being said, hey Kiesha.
Hi Ben, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. How's it going?
I'm excited that I'm not recording a physical practice today.
I'm excited too. You want to take us away and kind of just get us rolling on these sutras?
I think I can do that, definitely. Where do we begin? We begin now, right? And that's exactly what we do. We begin now. And I think I like to level set with yoga's a philosophy, a way of seeing. It's something, like Ben and I said, we like to kind of geek out on it and look at it from that lens. There's so many different ways that you could look at life, and we've chosen to go down this path of yoga, so we're honoring it by further understanding it. So what I'm really just trying to say is you can believe it, you cannot believe it. It's just a way of looking at things, and it's a way that I choose to look at things that has been really grounding and supportive, just like the physical practice that we do. So when it comes to the Yoga Sutras, and we have a copy here that will reference, the first sutra is Atta Yoga Anushasanam. Atta Yoga Anushasanam. And these sutras, they're these little threads or these writings, some people say they're poems, and they can stand alone. They can stand alone each word, and then of course the bigger body of the work creates this big quilt, and hopefully that quilt is something that can cover you, embrace you when you actually need the tools in your life. So when we start with the sutras, Atta Yoga Anushasanam, I like to go off of what teacher Indu Arora suggests, that you can pull one nugget from the sutra, and that really tells you the embodiment of it. And of course, you could pick any of the words. The words I always navigate to is Atta. And my Sanskrit teacher, Dr. Marcy, kind of says it's like a force. Atta. We start now, we begin now, and that vibration of the ta gets you jump started on it. So I say, now we begin, which is what Ben and I are doing at the beginning of the book. It's what happens at the beginning of the physical practices. Start in child's pose. Bring yourself inward to the practice. This Atta can show up anywhere. So I'm going to ask you, Ben, where are you starting right here, right now? Atta with the Yoga Sutras.
Where am I starting? Are you asking me?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the way I like to think of it is like the Atta is like, it's like every passing moment is like we start again, we start again, we start again. I think of, I honestly don't even remember what teacher this was, but I was in a class one time years ago, and the teacher said at the very beginning of class, let this mark a moment in time. And to me, that was resembling of the first Yoga Sutra of now begins the yoga. You know, it begins now. Mark this moment. Let this be a turning of a new page. And we can come back to that when we start something, like when we started this little podcast, or when we start our yoga practice or our meditation, or in quite literally every single moment is a new now. And I'm really glad that you brought up the Atta, because that's the word that also jumps out to me in this first Yoga Sutra. And I feel like I see and hear a lot of people just breeze over the first sutra and go right into Yoga Sutra 1.2, which we'll get to, because that one is a powerhouse, and that one, like, 1.2 is perhaps the most quoted sutra of all time and has the famous definition of yoga. But I think the first Yoga Sutra, Atta Yoga Anushāsanam, has a world to explore on its own. Like, what do we mean by now? Well, we know that now is not the past. It's not in our memories. What's the Sanskrit word for memories? Is it smriti, or is that something? Am I thinking of something
We're
else?
going to get to it in the sutras.
Yeah, we will get there. We will get there. It's in not too long from now. But it's not in the past. It's not in the future, which is our imagination. It's right now, and that's where the yoga happens. So, as Kiesha mentioned, the first sutra it's like an invocation. It's like a beginning of whatever it is that we are doing, or it's the beginning of our practice. But it's also referring to where we are in, like, the time-space continuum, how yoga doesn't happen in the past, yoga doesn't happen in the future, yoga happens in now. And when is now? Now is fluid, right? So now is, like, constantly changing. So even if we're thinking back to the yoga practice that we did an hour ago, that's no longer now, and that's no longer where the yoga is. The yoga is now, even if what we're doing now is, like, eating a cheeseburger, you know, like, that is the now. That's where the intention has to be.
So a lot of things are going on in my mind as Ben's talking, but what I keep saying as a practice is now, be present with what Ben is saying now. Be present with what Ben is saying now, so I can gain the richness of what Ben has to share, as opposed to me being in my head of thinking of what to say next or what we're going to say next. So to me, that shows up as the practice right here. Begin again each time I notice that I'm wandering or drifting off of the course. Begin again, begin again. Now, of course, I thought a whole lot of things, and I kept storing them in the background. What I love that you said was the invocation. Right? The beginning, let's get this started, and also the invocation of an honoring of the practice that we're about to do. And of course, we reference the physical practice because that's, you know, what our channel is, and most of us have come into the practice through the physical. But when I come to take Ben's class here at the Coterie, Ben's gonna ground me with some breath work. Ben might have me chant Om. That's one way of saying, we're starting the practice of yoga. Let's honor the practice of yoga. That's what this sutra does for us as well, this invocation. The sutras are also looked at as ways of meditating. They're tools, just like sitting, closing my eyes, concentrating on breath. The sutras are used to kind of meditate on and to focus on. So that's how we could spend just this entire recording focusing on this one and continuing to break it down. So I love that you brought the invocation in, the honoring in. And when we talk historically about the sutras, there's the belief that there was work before we opened up this book. So we did some work in our lives that brought us either into a yoga studio or to recording. We did some work. And now picking up this book or clicking like or whatever play on this video, something drew you in, you did the work, and now you're beginning the practice of yoga. And I would say the deeper practice of yoga, which is further exploration, self-study of yoga. So we have Atta, which is now, yoga, which is the practice, the science, the tools, whatever you're defining yoga as. I can speak for Ben because we're in a teacher training group together. We define yoga as those practices that unite body, mind, and spirit. And there's so many ways that you can do that practice. And then the Anushāsanam is like the system. Right? It's a subject, like you might learn chemistry or photography. So now we begin the study of the subject of yoga, and it's get ready, let's do it now. When you're also talking, it reminded me of meditation and how we can constantly come back again and again and again when the mind does wander, when we are taken off course. Yoga, as one teacher kind of said to me, is yoga loves you and embraces you. It never says, Kiesha, you haven't picked this book up in 3 years. What are you doing? It says, no, we begin here, we begin now. And one more add, I think of that beginner's mind. When Ben messaged me and was like, Kiesha, let's do some sutras. And I was like, okay, where are we going to begin, right? I have my preferences. Ben said, let's begin at the beginning. So I said, clear the slate, let me get out my notes, let me start to study and become the student again so that I can learn from Ben, and hopefully I'll get to learn from you all by what you put in the comments or ask from us. So with that, Ben, what more would you add about Hatha Yoga Anushasanam as it relates to this moment, this place and time for you as a student of yoga, as a householder in the US? How does this resonate and embody in your life?
I think right now I'm thinking about how we're sitting here talking about yoga philosophy, right? And yoga it says in a variety of ways, and lots of scriptures and lots of teachers have said this, that merely knowing the philosophy of yoga doesn't really get us very far. It's all about putting it in action and in motion and actually doing the practices. And so with this sutra, it's the way I look at it is not saying like, and now, I'm going to teach you yoga. It's like, and now it's almost like the journey of yoga begins. I see it often translated as the exposition of yoga, that word anushasana. And the word exposition kind of infers that it's something that is demonstrated and practiced rather than just being read about. So if we were to just read the sutras and even memorize them and learn them really well, it would almost be doing the philosophy a disservice, because the philosophy is meant to be practiced. And Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras, took a lot of inspiration from Sankhya philosophy, and Sankhya is kind of known to be like the philosophy, and yoga is the practices that are born from that philosophy. And these are not the Sankhya Sutras, although there are texts just related to Sankhya. These are the Yoga Sutras, and so there's a kind of inferring that these are things that we should be prepared to practice. Like when we read about meditation, we should put it in practice and meditate and see if we can maybe experience for ourselves the things that are being spoken about. So it's more of I suppose, a guidebook than a textbook.
100%.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely would agree. A guidebook more than a textbook. And sometimes I'll remember teachers, other times not, always honoring that I didn't make this up. These aren't my words. This is stuff that I've learned, embodied. I always resonate with one teacher that said the Yoga Sutras has 4 padas, 4 chapters, 4 books, and that the 4 books were meant for 4 different students. And they say the same thing. They take you on the same exposition, but they take you there in a different way. And as you'll see, I have 2 of the padas, 2 of the chapters. These are the books by Pandit Rajmani Tigunait, forgive me for pronunciation, PhD with the Himalayan Institute. And this book here is the Samadhi Pada, which Ben and I are referencing, this first sutra. So this is all in regards to the first book. And then this is the second book, which is the Sadhana Pada. And I know this is the book in the journey that I initially took when I entered into yoga. And what they said is, this is the book of the householder, the person that needs to kind of know what to do and how to do it. When we do get to this is the book that says, do asana, do breathing, do meditation. Book 2. Book 1 is the book that says, hey, if you focus and concentrate, everything's going to be okay, or at least it'll be a little bit better. But for some of us, we need to know, well, how do I concentrate? And that's what book number 2 kind of brings you into. Then book 3 and 4, for other types of students, you might be that student that, can levitate, can, contemplate and connect to the ethereal. You might also be that student that says, you know what, I'm not even watching this video anymore. I'm packing my bags and I'm going to the Himalayas and I'm going to embody the practices there. So these 4 books are different ways for us to go on this exposition and journey. And that's what I think about, as you just mentioned, we're always kind of beginning again and again. And you could pick up anywhere. Have you read the book from front to back?
No.
Nope. Not saying
Actually,
anybody hasn't.
Yes.
Yes?
I have. But not with the interpretation. I've read them. I've read it straight through, just reading the translation, because the sutras themselves are very short. They're like little aphorisms. And anytime, I think this is good that you brought up like book 1, book 2, and we can talk about the 4 padas or parts or chapters of the sutras. And like as Kiesha kind of demonstrated, in this translation by Pandit Rajmani Tigunait, it's literally a whole book for book 1 and a whole other book for book 2. And then maybe there's one for 3 and 4. But often you'll see all 4 books are condensed into one, because it just, it's less material and it's easier to digest. And so, what were we talking about?
Who knows?
Yeah. So anyways, I thought it'd be helpful to just say like what these books are and what they represent. So
I remember what you were talking about taking the time to go through it as we are. Because if you do read it front to back, you can, but it's not like one and done. I read the book and I put it on the shelf.
If only it was that easy.
If you could see my 2 books, the Sadhana Pada is a little bit more worn than the Samadhi Pada. And now I'm coming back to the Samadhi Pada. Or just like when Ben teaches us that one-legged crow, right? It's not like you master the one-legged crow and then you say, I'm done with yoga, I don't come back. You can master one-legged crow with a different muscle engagement, or it just changes based upon where you're at. So it's a constant coming back to the teachings and the practice.
Yeah, and like we might have time where we focus on one-legged crow a lot more than other poses, but we also might go a few years without touching one-legged crow because we're more focused on other poses, or maybe we don't really care about arm balances in that season, or maybe we have an elbow injury and we don't want to practice any floating arm balances. And so I think an effective way to study the sutras is finding areas, whether it's one sutra or a collection of sutras, because often they go together in like little bunches. Like the sutras, they like potentially really liked listicles, so like one sutra will be like, there are 5 different ways of thinking, and then the next 5 sutras are going through each of those 5 ways of thinking. We'll get to it. But I think we don't need to stress ourselves out with understanding the entirety of the sutras. It's a really approachable and enjoyable way to study the sutras, of just going kind of 1 at a time or 3 at a time, and they don't have to go in order. As Kiesha said, she started with the Sadhana Pada, and the Sadhana Pada, book 2, is perhaps the most usable, because that's where the sadhanas are. Sadhana means like practice or spiritual practice. And so that gives us a lot of things to do that are maybe a little bit more worldly or understandable or applicable to our modern day life, even though these were written about 2,000 years ago. The Samadhi Pada is book 1, and Samadhi is translated many different ways, but it can mean the state of meditative absorption. And so I view the Samadhi Pada as like describing to us what the goal of yoga is, which is samadhi and meditation and concentration, and it tells us some ways to get there, which is things like chanting Om and dedicating oneself to Ishvara, which we'll get to what Ishvara is, and that's a whole conversation, that's a whole video probably on its own. And so you can start where you start, and it can be a really good thing if you ever notice that you're very interested by one sutra, dive into that sutra and the ones around it, and read multiple translations, ask some questions to ChatGPT about that sutra, learn all the different words in that sutra, memorize that sutra, because memorizing and learning one sutra really well is potentially more impactful and beneficial than learning all of them but not really knowing them well. So one at a time, and we don't need to be intimidated by them in that way, because we can give ourselves our whole lifetime to just learn, maybe one book or maybe 2 books.
I would also add, one could be a lifetime, right? One could be a lifetime where you find the sutra that resonates with you and you keep embodying it. Example for me would be in the second book in regards to Kriya Yoga, which is the primary practice that I learned from my teacher Maya. And that's how I kind of stumbled upon the sutras. It would be a teacher might reference one in class, like Rauda's awesome for doing that. And then I'd be like, okay, let me learn a little bit about it. So then I go to my reference book or to Google. I'm sure you have multiple copies of the sutras. And that's something I think we should also just kind of say, right? This is Kiesha and Ben's interpretation of reading books, of being with other teachers, of learning with other students through conversation, just like Pandit Rajmani Tigunait, PhD, has his own version and philosophy of it. And like Ben said, this is a whole book on the chapter where you might pick up another person's interpretation and it's 2 pages. So there's so many interpretations. It's kind of for you to kind of discern, which is another word in the sutras that will come to the discernment. You identifying what lands for you and still honoring it and then sharing it.
Yeah, I just picked up a copy of Swami Vivekananda's translation of the sutras, and it's a tiny little book. That's the reason I got it. I wanted to flip through it and see if it might be a good translation for beginners, because this is 1/4 of the sutras, according to this translator. In the copy that I picked up, all 4 books fit into a copy that's like maybe a quarter of the size of just this one book. So I think that's another thing that's freeing, is you can pick up like a super academic, super thick translation and really like decipher it, or you can get like a pocket version, and it's not that deep, and wherever we start is wherever we start. But we will find a fair amount of variation in how these sutras are translated and by whom. So over time, it's okay to start with one translation, but over time, it can be fun to pick up a bunch of translations and see how these things can be interpreted differently, because these were written a couple thousand years ago. These were likely passed down from oral tradition a while before they were eventually written down. And they weren't written down in English, they were written down in Sanskrit. And they were written in a way that is so concise that it's necessary to interpret them. And so there is the earliest ever commentary on the sutras, and any translation you buy, there will be a commentary that goes along with each sutra. The earliest one is said to be written by some sage named Vyasa. Some people think Vyasa is just like still Patanjali, just under a different like stage name. Some people think Vyasa was a different person. But we do need kind of someone to interpret the sutra, because the information in itself is so concise and brief that we have to unpack it and let it unfold and unfurl. And you brought up Rauda, and I wanted to come back to that, and also to bring us back to Yoga Sutra 1.1. Rauda often ends her classes by saying Atta Yoga Anushasanam. So even though that's the first sutra, and we talked about how it's used at the beginning of something as an invocation, Rauda at the end of her yoga asana classes says Atta Yoga Anushasanam. When you leave the yoga studio, then the yoga begins, because when we leave the yoga studio, it's not like our practice is over. It's not like we're done. It's a new Atta, it's a new now. When we get in the car and we're driving through traffic and someone cuts us off, you're in the now. So what are we gonna do about it? Now we're dropping some good knowledge. Just one sutra too.
Just one sutra too. And what you shared about Rauda made me think about this book itself, the first Pada, where we did some pre-work in Rauda's class. Now we actually begin the practice, which is taking it, quote unquote, off of the mat. What I also think about with this sutra and our modern day yoga, you're very familiar with the Baptiste methodology of yoga. And I always remember taking these classes, and they would always say, be a yes now. And on the walls, they have these big mantras that say, now, do it now. Go into wheel pose 8 times, now, now, now. And as I am further along in my journey, I see how that was a way of tapping into the principles of the practice to create the methodology that supports that style of yoga. So be a yes now is one way how I saw this kind of showing up outside of the classical text in the readings. So yeah, always being able to begin and restart.
Yeah, every moment is a new beginning. And that should be encouraging, you know, that we always have an opportunity to draw a line, let the past be the past, and we can draw a fresh start for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Should we go into Yoga Sutra 1.2? How long have we been going? We've been going for, almost 30 minutes. That's good.
That is great. What I want to add would be from my notes that stood out to me was we talk about the sutras being this thread, but then it can also be seen as a thread, as a rope, and that rope being a mala, as we know, that necklace, and that mala being kind of the rope that ties us along the journey that we're taking until we get to the end destination. And the end destination could be book number 4, which is Kaivalya. When we talk about book 1 starting with Atta, book 4 ends with Iti, which means so it is, so it be done. So the sutras in itself are this rope, this mala, this thread, this garland, which also then connects me to the garland of Sanskrit and the language. And you had said something about the commentaries. The commentaries definitely help to pull us in. And these were not the original versions that I learned from. My first version, I think, was in the Heart of Yoga, which is all compact and very still. These were versions that I came to decades later because I wanted to know more and hear it in a different light. But what I definitely always recommend and have gotten to the point in my life of not necessarily needing the commentary and being able to understand and break down the Sanskrit. And using the Sanskrit as a point of record. So if you do choose to get a copy of the sutras, look for one that has the diacritical marks to support you with the pronunciation. And if I'm looking at this version, Atta means now, Yoga, union, balance, Anushasanam, instruction. So we could just sit with that. Now, yoga, instruction. And then Kiesha's going to interpret it one way. Ben will interpret it another way. Pandit Rajmani interpreted it another way. Patanjali interpreted it another way. You're going to interpret it another way. Yeah.
Very well said, and I think that's really great advice to pick up a copy that has the diacritical marks in the Sanskrit. And that's when the Sanskrit is translated to English, you'll see it written, and that's the little lines over the A's and a line over the S and stuff like that. And it really does make it a lot easier to learn how to pronounce the words. And also look for a translation that has each Sanskrit word translated directly to English, because then we can do what we're doing of I'm fascinated by this word atta. And by studying the Yoga Sutras, you don't have to think of it this way, but over time you're learning Sanskrit, And we may never learn, I don't think I'll ever learn Sanskrit to a conversational ability, but that's kind of not really the point, because it's not much of a conversational language in today's world. But it is a way to keep the origins of yoga alive, is just to learn Sanskrit words and share them. If you're a yoga teacher, you can even just share one word, with your class and kind of keep the tradition alive and give people little pockets of this ancient wisdom that was created way back when, but is still so relevant today. Mm-hmm. So I think let's kind of pause the video there, and we'll pick up with Yoga Sutra 1.2 in the next video. And I'm kind of glad that we took the whole video today just to talk about 1.1 and to talk about the context of the Yoga Sutras, because I think that's honestly enough to think about for now. And we'll get into it on the next one. And so why don't you drop in the comments, for those of you who are still watching, you made it through the whole video, why don't you drop in the comments what is now for you? What is your practice now? What are some things that are important to you in how you're spending your time and your presence now? What does your yoga practice look like now? Because that will change over time as we change and grow, and the things that we need change and grow along with that. So, Atta, what is present for you now? What is your intention now?
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kiesha. We will catch y'all on the next one. Shout out Patanjali. Peace.